welcome to this special broadcast that we are bringing to you in collaboration with Voice of America. The Pacific Island nations are pushing back against Japan's request to release into the ocean treated radioactive wastewater from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. The plant was disabled in a major accident about 12 years ago. During the G7 Environment Ministers meeting this month, the islanders' efforts appear to have gained momentum. And Voice of America's Jessica Stone gets you the story.
The Pacific Islands region is home to millions of marine animal species. Experts say some 44% are endangered or under threat. It's also home to people who make their living off the bounty of the sea.
It's our life. The ocean provides almost everything that we need for livelihood because we are ocean states.
Kiribati Ambassador Tibururu Sito says that's why people of the region are concerned about a proposal by Japan's nuclear power company, TEPCO, to release more than 1 million metric tons of treated nuclear wastewater from the Fukushima plant into the Pacific. Japanese officials maintain they can make the water safe.
The continued progress in decommissioning efforts, including the release of advanced liquid processing system, treated water into the sea, as well as Japan's science-based and transparent approach, has been appreciated.
The International Atomic Energy Agency says Japan is running out of storage space for the water and is following recommended safety standards for treating the contaminants. But at a recent gathering of Group of 7 environment ministers, Germany's top environment official refused to endorse the plan.
It is obvious that the ministers of environment cannot support the feeding back of contaminated substances into water anywhere in the world.
This release is absolutely unprecedented in terms of the scale.
Ivana Nikolic-Hughes is a chemical engineer who directs Columbia University's nuclear research in the Marshall Islands. It was here that the United States conducted 67 nuclear tests between 1946 and 1958. Nikolic-Hughes says more than 60 years later, her research team found radioactive elements in the coconuts here.
The radiation is still there. And I think for me, the big lesson is there's no such thing as this kind of safe use or safe testing.
In February, the Pacific Islands Forum met with TEPCO, demanding additional studies of the decontamination process to assure members the release won't poison the water or the wildlife.
It must be safe. It must not impact adversely on the lives of their people.
TEPCO has so far delayed the release, giving opponents more time to push for other options. Nikolic-Hughes says one alternative should be locating additional storage tanks to house the nuclear wastewater until the radioactive isotopes break down further. Jessica Stone, VOA News.
All right, now to get us more updates in terms of what all of this, of course, means, we're being joined in by Jessica Stone, who's joining us live from the White House in Washington, D.C. Now, Jessica, looking ahead at the Group of 7 for next month, when the heads of states return to Japan for the annual summit, what do we know at this point of time about who's coming and also what's on the agenda there?
Well, the agenda is still taking shape, Mohammed, but we know that Australia and India will also be in attendance, and the Japanese have also invited Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, which indicates that the war in Ukraine will be a top point of discussion for the G7 members. We also know that they are considering inviting the Indonesians and the South Koreans, and that engaging and how best to engage with China as it increases its assertiveness in the region will also be on the agenda. That, of course, coming to the fore as we're seeing increased military drills in and around Taiwan, given the increase in tensions between the U.S. and China, meetings between Tsai Ing-wen, the president there, and the House Speaker Kevin McCarthy in the last couple of weeks. And so engaging with China will also be on the agenda. And one point of interest here, we heard from the Prime Minister this week that ChatGPT is also going to be a point of discussion at these meetings. Mohammed?
Absolutely, indeed. And also the fact that the U.S.-China relations have taken another bit of a hit this week with the FBI arrest of 2 Chinese Americans on charges that they staffed a secret police station for the Chinese Ministry of Public Security. Now, these are allegedly all over the world. Now, what's the latest on this front?
Well, this case is already beginning to wind its way through the courts. We had 61-year-old Liu Jianwing, who is also known as Harry, as well as 59-year-old Chen Jinping. They were both arrested on Monday in New York, where they live, for basically setting up a secret police station on behalf of the Chinese Ministry of Public Security in New York City's Chinatown, and operating out of that as emissaries of the Chinese government without ever registering as foreign agents of the Chinese government. What took place there, according to U.S. officials, is that they were asked to spy on Americans, to look for dissidents, to harass Chinese American dissidents and people who spoke out against the Chinese government on social media. There were also an indictment of around 36 Chinese Ministry of Public Security employees who also are accused of harassing Chinese dissidents on social media. And, you know, they both have been arraigned and have appeared before a judge and have been released on bond. But this is a pattern of behavior that the U.S. government says they will continue to prosecute against people who are used by the Chinese government to intimidate Chinese citizens or Chinese Americans inside the United States on behalf of the Chinese government. And as for Beijing's reaction, well, they have said basically there is no such thing as an overseas police station. In fact, this is the U.S. attempt at political manipulation.
All right, indeed. Do continue to stay on with us, Jessica, because I want you to weigh in on another important story, where the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency this week has released proposals for new vehicle emission standards. The standards will be the most aggressive emission restrictions in the country's history, with the expectation that electric vehicles will now account for nearly about 2 of every 3 cars that will be produced in the United States of America by the year 2032. The Voice of America's Keith Koczynski gets us more details on the story.
Charging started.
Alex Brown has owned an electric vehicle for a decade and is part of an EV car club. He has a passion for electric cars stemming from his desire to combat climate change.
I had kind of an epiphany when I had my first child, right? And we had just purchased this home, and I was thinking about his future. And I was really concerned about it.
The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency announced its intention to raise emission standards in the U.S. for cars and trucks with a goal of improving air quality across the nation. The Biden administration claims the proposals would avoid nearly 10 billion tons of CO2 emissions, equivalent to more than twice the total U.S. CO2 emissions in 2022.
I think that it's a move into the right direction. I think it's kind of a shame we haven't done more.
The EPA projects that EVs could account for 67% of new light-duty vehicle sales in the U.S. by 2032. Presently, the number sits at around 7%.
It's ambitious. At the same time, we need these sorts of big, bold, ambitious moves in order to be able to address the crisis, the potential crisis of climate change.
In the EU countries as well as China, EV sales account for over 20% of auto sales, according to the firm Counterpoint Research and European Commission.
Globally, it is happening. Everywhere it's happening, all the countries. It's not that it's just happening in US. If you resist the change, others will take benefit of that.
The Biden administration touts Americans will save over $1 trillion at the pump, should the proposal be adopted. While there is optimism, there are looming concerns.
There's some uncertainty about how the industry is going to react. Are consumers going to want to buy these cars? Are the prices going to come down sufficiently? Are the minerals that go into the batteries that required for electric vehicles, are those going to be available? Are the charging stations going to be built in sufficient numbers?
Experts also say the auto industry must adapt to the new changes and shifts in labor. Another concern: over 60% of U.S. electricity is still derived from fossil fuels.
You're going to need to make sure that the supply of electricity is affordable, but also is not itself, creating bigger problems for the environment than this whole transition is trying to solve. So you really need to move the generation of electricity to renewables as well.
Renewable energy sources are growing in the United States, for the first time accounting for more electricity production than coal. Brown believes the only direction is to move forward with EVs.
I really think we're going to look back on these old gas cars and say, wow, that was smelly. How did people deal with all that air pollution back then?
The proposed new EPA greenhouse gas emission standards must undergo a public hearing before becoming official. The hearing will take place virtually on May 2nd and 3rd. Keith Kosinski for VOA News.
All right, so this, of course, is the topic that everyone is talking about, is to have in future will only have electric vehicles. And Jessica Stone from Voice of America from the United States is still with us. Jessica, what policies is the Biden administration, in fact, putting in place to support the EV industry to achieve its targets?
Yeah, it's really a puzzle that the U.S., like so many other countries, is still trying to put together, because you do need not only the vehicles but the charging stations. The Inflation Reduction Act, which is a law that was passed last year, did have money to meet some of these needs. It had $7.5 billion to fund charging stations around the country. It had $7 billion specifically to invest in the battery production, sourcing critical minerals and the like. And the private sector, according to the White House, has already spent about $100 billion around the country forming these charging stations, building these charging stations. We know that just in the last couple of weeks, Tesla announced that it is opening up its charging stations to non-Teslas so that they can use those as well. And there was an announcement last month as well that Hertz and BP, the oil giant, are partnering to build out a charging network specifically for electric vehicles throughout the United States. Mohammed.
Absolutely, indeed. Now, the real challenge for all countries investing in electric vehicles is about sourcing enough of those critical minerals that are needed to make the batteries. Now, where is Washington on this front?
Well, in a word, Washington is behind. In fact, if you look at a New York Times investigation with specifics, the U.S. actually sold its last cobalt mine to a Chinese company back in 2016. And even though it raised flags at the U.S. State Department and here at the National Security Council at the White House, it did go through because the Chinese company had the ready cash. The U.S. company was intent on selling, and that was the last U.S.-owned mine for cobalt in the country of Congo, which has the largest supply of the all-important mineral of cobalt, which is essential in these batteries. And, you know, that has really continued to reverberate throughout the U.S. government, the idea that the U.S. government needs to have stronger relationships, that U.S. companies need to have stronger relationships with the mines throughout the world, in South America, in the countries within Africa. And Indonesia was actually, interestingly, in the Washington, D.C. this week, the finance minister talking about this, according to our colleagues at VOA Indonesia, looking to have a special trade relationship with the United States in order to meet some of these needs. But certainly the U.S. used to be ahead. Now it feels very much behind in having access to these minerals as the whole world seeks to source these very important minerals for EVs throughout the world.
Absolutely, indeed, because that, of course, appears to be the crux of the EV industry and is to have it moves forward. Thank you very much indeed, Jessica Stone, for joining us and getting us all those details there from Washington, D.C.